Everyone, this is Tom Fox back for another episode, and you are in for a treat today because I am in for a treat today. And the reason we are both in for treats today is we're thrilled to have with us Kimberly Garza. She is one of the leading women or authors of letters in the state of Texas, and I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. So, with that incredibly long winded introduction, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Oh, that's such a kind intro. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
After reading your bio, I probably ought to start with, have you been writing since you were a little girl?
I I think in some ways, yes. That's probably true for a lot of writers. I don't know if I would have called what I was doing writing at the time because I was such a big reader. And so I thought what I was writing are these like small things. I'm writing a scene, or I would rewrite the ending of a book. If I read a book and didn't like where it ended, or I wanted to kind of stick with the characters, I'd like write another scene with the characters. I guess the kids would call it fan fiction, right? So I think in some ways, yes, I have been sort of thinking about these things and writing small pieces since I was young, but I don't think I put together a full like narrative, a short story, or until I was probably well into high school and learned about short stories and learned about like breaking apart the things I was reading and starting to think about them as a writer. And that happened much later than I think I'd begun reading.
Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and where you went to college and got your postgraduate degrees?
Sure. Yeah. I was born in Galveston. I grew up in Uvalde. So we lived there from the time I was 3 to the time I was 18. And my family was still there and is still there in some aspects. And I went to college at UT Austin, and I was an English major. So that's really where I got the launch into reading all the time and writing a lot and talking about reading and writing a lot. And I got the bug after that. I left, I got my degree, and I went into magazine writing. I worked for a magazine for a couple of years as an editor. And then I had, I'd been bitten. I had the bug. I wasn't getting enough time with writing fiction, which is really what I wanted to be doing. So I went back to UT Austin and did a master's degree in English and creative writing over 2 years. And so I did that there. I went back afterwards into magazine writing and journalism, and then kind of called it and said, no, you're not done going to school. You're not done studying this. And then I went back for a PhD at the University of North Texas in Denton. And I did a PhD until 2019. And I've been teaching at UTSA ever since.
What do you teach at UTSA?
I'm in the English department, and so primarily I teach creative writing. That's what I was hired for, and I'm very fortunate to get to teach that at the university level and with the students that are at UTSA, who are fabulous, fabulous students. And so I primarily teach creative writing, fiction, nonfiction, undergraduate and graduate, and on occasion when necessary and when I'm lucky enough, I get to teach Latinx literature too at the graduate level.
What was the topic of your dissertation?
It was the beginning of my first novel, actually. So as I said, I did a PhD at UNT, and the program I was in is a PhD in English with a focus in creative writing. So you do take all of the necessary doctoral courses, you do all the necessary doctorate steps, but the dissertation that you produce is a primarily, other than an introduction that's quite hefty, is primarily a work of creative writing in your chosen genre. So mine was a collection of short stories, and it ended up being the basis. I revised it myself. I revised it later over the following 2 years with my agent and then with my editor when we sold the book into what is The Last Karankawas, which is my novel in stories, as I like to call it.
Let's start at the end, or at least where you are perhaps now, and talk about the last Karankawas. For those poor few who don't know who the Karankawas were or even are, who were
Yeah.
or are the Karankawas?
Yeah, the Karankawas, which is true for the book and the characters in the book, and the way I approached my understanding of the people was what I was taught in schools, which I know now as an adult, very flawed, and was really built on myths that were perpetuated about them. But what I was taught was that they were an indigenous group that had settled along the Texas coast. They were among the first inhabitants here when Texas started getting settled and colonized by the first the Texans and later the Americans. And the myth about them was that they had died out. And as a child in fourth grade or seventh grade, who had been born in Galveston, you hear them talked about a lot, and there was such mystery to the idea of an entire people that could vanish, from a city that I knew. And so that was really fascinating to me. And it's just one of many aspects of like the history of Texas and the history of Galveston in particular, who is the focus of the last Karankawas, that it stuck with me when I sat down to kind of write. And I was thinking about place and I was thinking about people in present day, but kind of the stories that were built upon that we think are part of us and that we believe are part of us, true or not, everything's a story really. And I, like my characters, kind of come to discover, for me, it was early in the writing of it, but for my characters, it's very late in the book, that the Karankawas are not gone, right? They are not vanished. They have not gone extinct. They are still very much present. There are people who have had entire histories taught to them through this belief that only they have, because there are very few written records about them by them. And the recognition of their people has been very hard to come by as far as the powers that be. So it's a lot of oral history, it's a lot of kind of fighting for visibility and to counteract the myth that no, we're not gone, we're still here, we've been here, and we're surviving, we're thriving. So those are the Karankawa that exist in reality, very much so. And in the book, I'd say two of the it's a large cast of characters, but two of the main characters at the core of it are a young woman from Galveston named Carly and her grandmother Magdalena, who has raised her in Galveston, from Galveston, to believe that they are descendants of the Karankawa. And Carly has only ever heard the idea that they've been gone, that there's nobody left. And so it really kind of colors the way that she and her grandmother approach differently being from Galveston and like what it means to be of here and to stay really connected to the land.
Would you say you brought a Latina perspective to talking about the Karankawas?
I mean, I would say I brought my own perspective, for whatever that means. As someone who is a Latina, yes, certainly. Sorry, I got something in my eye. Is a Latina, certainly, yes. I think that I can't help but do that. I think of the ways in which my Tejana side, which is my father's family, the ways in which everyone kind of who has been in this strange position of living in the same area, living in the same space, and having the politics of where you are change without without your ideas, without your efforts, and without any movement on your part, really. You have that thing, that idiom that people say a lot, which is like, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And it's very true for a lot of peoples, not just Tejano people, not just Mexican American people, but for a lot of peoples. All of a sudden you wake up one day and the border has changed. And so now you are no longer in the place that you are in a new place that's labeled, and maybe you are labeled in a different way because of where these borders are, right? So I definitely tried to bring that perspective to the idea of what Carly and Magdalena are thinking about themselves, which is where we're from, right? And who we are. But I also think I brought the perspective of my mother and her family, which my mother was an immigrant from the Philippines. So she came through the immigration process the way I think many people think of immigration, right? It's a distance, and there's a procedure to it, and there's legalities, and you leave your home and you come to another one, and there's sort of almost like a clean definition of I was from here and now I'm here. But even that is much more complicated than it sounds, right? So I really tried to bring both. And I know that only kind of scratches the surface of how people, have these really complicated relationships to where we're from and where we are. So I hope that I just sort of touched on like some of those complexities, and everyone else can kind of fill in the rest.
For those not from the great state of Texas,
Mm.
they would consider a Hispanic an immigrant. But half of you is Tejano, and Tejano are indigenous Texans,
Mhm.
in my mind at
That's right.
least.
Yeah.
And do you ever have to explain to people, perhaps from outside of Texas, no, we're Texans. We just call ourselves Tejanos because we were here before
Yeah.
the others got here, as opposed to an immigrant family. And I've always found that dichotomy incredibly interesting, at least inside the state of Texas.
It is, and I mean, it's just getting more and more just I don't know. I don't think this conversation will ever go away, and maybe it shouldn't. It just gets more and more complicated, and it really changes and evolves depending on the politics of the moment, right? Which we're in a key political shift right now. So it's something that I'm paying attention to and I'm thinking about. It's definitely something that I think I've had conversations with other people about, certainly with my students too. Like this is something that not just my creative writers think about, it's something that my graduate students, UTSA and the English department are very fortunate to have a really strong PhD program that has an emphasis an important emphasis on Latinx studies. And just, every student, regardless of what they want to study in their PhD in English, has to take a Latinx literature, a Latinx studies course. So these conversations come up a lot because we have a lot of students from Texas, certainly, but we also have a lot of students from out of state. We have a lot of international students from various countries, who kind of come to this, to Texas and learn about Mexico and its relationship to Mexico for the first time, like as, PhD students, which is really fascinating to me. So it is something I've had to talk about and have been lucky to talk about with really great minds and really curious minds. And it's not easy. So I don't ever blame somebody for not understanding like the nuances of it. It's really complicated, but it's just one aspect of, I think, a conversation that happens all over the world, right? Like with as long as we've been here, people have moved. And what does moving look like? And what does it do for the people who are products of that movement? Right. And it's something that I think all the characters in my book grapple with in a different way. I tried to kind of present it in a different fashion for every single person.
Let me take things in a very different direction because you said something at the start of that answer that
Mhm.
really struck me, which is the city of Galveston.
Yeah.
And you talked about the relationship of the Karankawas Indians. And I thought you were going to say, and the original Spanish settlers came, but you talked about the Texicans or the Americans, the first group in the early part of the 18th century. The Karankawas were here long before that, but
Sure.
it struck me Galveston could be the focal point of multi-generation stories with the
Yeah.
tales of the city, whether it's one gigantic novel or, the 1830s becoming the second biggest city in the state of Texas, or I guess the largest city in the state, obviously the hurricane,
Right. The port. Yeah.
reinventing itself as the port of Galveston during World War II.
Mhm.
What we in Houston used to say was the rock and roll days of Galveston's gambling in the 50s and
Yeah. Yeah.
60s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all of that into, born on the island today. That still means something.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was very fortunate because I just sort of started as a younger writer. When I started writing what ended up being this book, I was just trying to think of a place that I loved. And I started writing the first, words of this book not long after Hurricane Ike had hit. And I had gone back to the island with my aunts and uncles and my grandparents who were still living in there and in the area. And I had seen, there was still this would probably have been like December or January. I think it was December, right after Ike in 2008. And I had seen like there was still a boat washed up off of Broadway. And so there's just like a boat on the side of the road where it shouldn't be. And they hadn't removed it yet. And my uncle pointed out all the trees that lined Broadway, which is these really beautiful, beautiful old trees. And he was pointing out how all the leaves were brown because they had drowned, right? Like that the surge in the water had gotten too high and they drowned. And so it was this, I mean, it was very sad, but Galveston was rebuilding at the time. And my family was very fortunate. They just had property damage, but it was fixable, no loss of life. And so, but even then it really seeped into me this new version of a place that I had known and that I loved and that I was really fascinated with learning more about. So when I sat down to write, I tend to start with place. I'm really moved by setting. And I started with Galveston. And so I just started writing a character who was thinking about whether or not she and her family should evacuate before Ike. And her grandmother didn't want to, and the granddaughter did. So I just started there. And the more I kind of dug into Galveston, the more I realized, like, God, this would be it could be a series of history books on Galveston alone. Like, I'm never going to touch all of this. And part of me really grappled with the responsibility of that. I'm certainly not the first person to ever write Galveston. Actually, the year I think my book came out, there were like two other amazing fiction novels about Galveston that same year. I think Sarah Bird had one. I know there were a number of people that they came out in the same time, which was lovely. But I kind of grappled with the weight of that. Like, I'm never going to be able to do Galveston justice. The Islanders are going to get really mad at me. I'm not going to mention everybody. I'm not going to talk about all these groups. But in the end, like, I hope I just sort of laid the groundwork for someone to do more investigation of, like, really just how fascinating that tiny island has been to so many periods of history, in what this area, this America, this Texas has been throughout the years. I mean, it really is fascinating. I tried my best to kind of put little nuggets of it tucked throughout the book. Like, you mentioned Jean Lafitte at one point, and you mention, the Maceo crime family, and it mentions like the many waves of immigration that have kind of come through Galveston. And that's about all I could do. And I thought, okay, to be continued by other research, by other writers.
Let me focus a little bit or ask you some questions rather about your writing process.
Sure.
I write largely nonfiction. I've written a couple of fictions books. So does this all play out in your head? Do you work it out in your head? Do you work it out as you're writing? Your characters talk back to you
Yeah.
as you're writing and,
Yeah.
allow you to explore them with you. How does that work?
Yeah. I mean, everybody's a different process, right? I think for me, I I don't ever have all of it in my head, if that makes sense. I think especially for something like a novel, you kind of can't. There's a really good novel has layers to it, and I might, even if I have the whole scope of the narrative, it's very surface. It's very brief and underdeveloped. It's very anemic in my mind. And I think this is something that I talk about with my students quite a bit, with my creative writing students, is just process. And for everyone it's different. For me, what I've found works best is to know the starting point very, very well to get me to begin writing. And what that also means is that I can't just simply have like an idea and then just let it ride, see what happens. I have to have a vague understanding of where they're going to end up. So I have to know the starting point, and I have to have an idea of the end game. And I have to sort of know the characters a little bit. Again, there's sort of vague sketches. I have an idea about who Carly is. I have an idea about who Magdalena is. And then, but it has to be enough to get me moving. And so then when I approach something like a short story, which, as I said, the early version of Karankawas was a collection of stories. So when I approach something like a short story, I had an idea for the story. Okay, there's gonna be a character and she wants to evacuate Galveston ahead of the hurricane. Her grandmother doesn't want to. Why doesn't her grandma want to? Okay, maybe the grandmother is starting to have like dementia and she's very confused by what's going on, and she just knows that this is home and she wants to stay home. Okay, got it. Go. And that usually is enough for me to kind of keep moving. But it's exactly what you said. Along the way, as you write, you're discovering the story. As I write, I'm discovering the story. So I learn the characters as I'm writing. I learn that Carly is kind of eager for the chance to evacuate. She's eager for the chance to leave. Why? Because she's only ever been here, and she's the kind of person who dreams of a life beyond this sort of family role that she's got and this place that she thinks is the only place she belongs. So then that seeps into the writing, and they start making their own decisions, which again sounds really strange, but they do. They kind of talk back when I put them in different positions, and I kind of imagine, okay, there's going to be this choice and she's going to go down this path. And I am as shocked as anyone when I start writing and no, they take path B, right? They turn and go the other way, or they do something that I wouldn't really expect. But it's because I think as I write, I start to learn the characters more. They become real people, and real people are complicated and messy. And I think a good character is complicated too. So the ending almost always changes. Even if I have that vague idea of where it's going, it almost always shifts a little bit because the characters are people and they do different things by the end. If any of that makes sense.
It makes complete sense to me. What do you tell your students or the aspiring writer? You tell them just write, follow your passion.
Yeah.
there's a lot of things you can do and be creative. How do you have that conversation
Yeah. Do you mean in terms of like careers, like jobs, or do you mean like writing process?
about following your passion?
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough, right? I mean, I was one of those people who thought I left high school and I thought I'm my path was always going to go to college. My parents were first gen college students, both of them, and to them, college was not an option for me, right? I was going to go. So the choice was only like what am I going to study, and then eventually what am I going to do? And I didn't know how to be a professional writer. And even in my time as an English major, I think I kept thinking teaching, or I kept thinking, I did journalism because that was the only real way that I thought writers got paid. I didn't know how to find my way into being a creative writer who was getting paid to do that. Right. It was almost always a side hustle or like a hobby, something I did after the 9 to 5. So when I talk to students about it, I tell them like, and times are tough and it's hard out here for anyone who wants to do a job in the humanities and the arts even, right? It's just going to get tougher. And so I tell them that we're always trying to be realistic. My students have the good fortune of having, UTSA's kind of career advisors behind them, helping them always with like job skills and packaging themselves, marketing themselves into different careers. But what I remind my students is that it's a writer writes, whether you're getting paid to write is a different thing, right? If you want to be a writer, you're supposed to be writing. And there are brilliant writers out there who are doing it alongside their jobs or, carving out the time after they've handled their families, right? That writing is not, just because you don't get paid to write doesn't mean you're not a writer. And so I do tell them as much as they are able, to whether you call it following your passion or whether you just call it making time for something that you really care about and believe in, that the writing will come. The publishing and the paying is a different story. And so we talk about that later. But just being a writer in the world means writing. It doesn't necessarily mean I have to have a job where I write.
Kimberly, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to connect with you, find out more about your work at UTSA and UTSA, your department, and of course, find out about your book. What would
Yeah.
be the best place or places for them to go?
Sure. I mean, everything's on the web now, right? And so easiest always is website. I have a website, kimberlygarza.com, just my full name. And that has links to like my social media and, updates on events that I'm doing. It also has links to where you can purchase the book. I always want to encourage people to look for it at their local bookstores, to support the booksellers always who have been so good to me and to my book. But I'm also from a rural town where it's hard to get books out there. So however you want to access it, support your libraries, support your bookstores, order it online. That's fine with me. And also, the UTSA Creative Writing Program is a good way to find out kind of how, my students and my work are kind of feeding into what UTSA's mission is. And so they can check out the UTSA English department and the creative writing program specifically within that.
Well, Kimberly, I want to thank you for just an incredibly delightful interview. I hope we can continue this conversation.
Yes, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Tom.